said get out! I did not marry a man!
The shouting began before the sky had fully decided whether it was morning. It cut through the quiet compound like a blade, sharp and deliberate, carrying years of resentment that had been waiting for permission to speak. Get out of my house! Grace stood still, barefoot on the cold concrete, her wrapper loose around her waist, her hands hanging helplessly at her sides. Her body shook, but she did not move. I said, get out, Daniel shouted again, his voice louder now, angrier, as though volume could erase guilt. I did not marry a man. His words echoed against the walls of the compound, drawing curious ears. Doors creaked open slowly. Windows shifted. Neighbors pretended to sweep, pretended to fetch water, pretended not to stare. Grace felt their eyes before she saw them. Behind Daniel came his mother, Margaret, her face tight with years of suppressed frustration. She didn't need to shout at first. Her silence alone was heavy. So you're still standing there? Margaret finally said, her voice low and cutting. After 5 years of eating my son's food? Grace swallowed. Margaret stepped closer, pointing a crooked finger at her. 5 years, she continued, raising her voice now. 5 years in this house and nothing. No pregnancy, no child. Nothing. What kind of woman sits in her husband's house and brings shame like this? Grace's chest tightened. Daniel bent abruptly, picked up Grace's small travel bag from beside the door and flung it toward her feet. Pack your things and leave, he said flatly. I'm tired. I want children. I need a real woman. Something inside Grace cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just quietly enough for no one to notice. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Years of swallowing words had trained her throat to stay silent when it mattered most. Margaret scoffed. Look at her, she said to no one in particular, standing there like a goat that doesn't understand English. Since when did barrenness become something to defend? Grace bent slowly, picked up the bag, adjusted her wrapper and straightened her back. Her hands trembled as she looked at Daniel. The man she married, the man who once knelt beside her and prayed over her womb, the man who once said, even if it takes 10 years, we'll face it together. He wouldn't look at her. So Grace turned and walked out. No one stopped her. It hadn't always been like this. Once, their marriage was full of laughter. Grace remembered their wedding day clearly. The warmth of Daniel's hands, the way he couldn't stop smiling, the way he leaned toward her during the ceremony and whispered, "You're my answered prayer." The first year of marriage passed like a gentle song. They prayed together every night. They cooked together. They planned their future with confidence. When the year ended without a pregnancy, Daniel laughed it off. He said, "We're still enjoying ourselves," pulling her close. "God's timing is perfect." Grace believed him. The second year came quietly. Questions started arriving, from aunties, from church members, from Margaret. "When will we hear good news?" Margaret asked one evening, smiling too tightly. Grace smiled back. "Soon, by God's grace." The third year brought pressure. Margaret's visits became frequent. Her eyes lingered too long on Grace's body. Her comments grew sharper. "A woman should not take this long," she said once, loud enough for Daniel to hear. Grace prayed harder. Hospitals said nothing was wrong. Doctors smiled and said, "Relax." Church members recommended fasting programs, prayer mountings, special services for waiting mothers. Grace attended all. Every month she waited. Every month disappointment arrived quietly. Daniel slowly withdrew. He stopped praying with her, stopped holding her hand in public, stopped defending her when his mother spoke. At night, Grace would turn toward him, hoping for comfort. He would sigh and turn away. By the fourth year, insults became normal. "You're wasting my son's time. Other women give birth easily. Are you cursed?" Grace endured it all. Every night she cried silently. Every morning she wiped her tears and prayed again. By the fifth year, patience snapped. That was the year she was chased out. Grace walked for a long time after she left Daniel's house. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stop. The early morning air was cold against her skin, but she barely felt it. Her feet ached, but the pain inside her chest was louder. Each step felt unreal, like she was walking out of someone else's life. People passed her on the road. Men heading to work, women balancing buckets on their heads, children in uniforms. No one asked questions. No one noticed that a woman's entire life had just been dismantled before sunrise. By the time Grace reached her parents' house, her legs were weak. Her mother opened the door and froze. "Grace?" she whispered, confusion flooding her face. "Why are you here so early?" Grace dropped her bag. That was all it took. She collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing so hard her body shook. Years of swallowed pain came pouring out in one uncontrollable wave. That morning, Grace did not explain everything. She didn't have the strength to form the words. She only cried and cried and cried, until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. 3 months later, Daniel remarried. The news spread quickly, the way such things always do. "Have you heard?" He didn't waste time. "They say the new wife is young." Her name was Lydia. She was 26, soft-spoken, from a respected family not too far away. When Margaret saw her for the first time, she smiled wide, something she hadn't done in years. "This one will bring children," Margaret declared confidently. "You can see it in her body." The wedding was not as grand as Daniel's first, but it was louder in gossip. Women whispered as they tied their wrappers tighter. Men nodded knowingly, as though the problem had finally been solved. Grace did not attend. She heard about it through neighbors, through relatives who spoke carefully, through the heavy silence that followed every mention of Daniel's name. On the wedding day, Grace stayed indoors. She sat on her parents' bed and stared at the wall. She did not cry. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because she was empty. Life in Daniel's house changed quickly. Lydia moved in with enthusiasm, determined to be everything Grace had apparently failed to be. She woke up early. She cooked eagerly. She laughed often. She called Margaret Mama with respect and sweetness. She listened attentively when Margaret spoke. She never talked back. Margaret was pleased. "Do you see?" she told Daniel proudly. "This is how a real woman behaves." Daniel relaxed. He smiled more. He stayed home more. He felt justified. For the first few months, the house was peaceful. Margaret boasted to neighbors. "She's glowing already," she said. "You will hear good news soon." Lydia heard those words and smiled nervously. Inside, she felt the weight of expectation settling quietly on her shoulders. 6 months passed. Nothing happened. Lydia noticed Margaret watching her more closely now, watching how she ate, watching how she walked, watching how she rested. One evening, as Lydia served dinner, Margaret asked casually, "You are not using any family planning, are you?" The spoon froze in her hand. "No, Mama," she replied quickly. "I'm not." Margaret nodded slowly but said nothing more. That night, Lydia lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling. She remembered Grace, the stories, the whispers, the way people spoke about her with certainty. A small fear stirred in Lydia's chest. 1 year passed. The house grew quieter. Margaret's patience thinned. "So what is the problem now?" she said one afternoon, her tone sharp. "You've been married for a year now. People are beginning to ask questions." Daniel said nothing. He had begun coming home later again, sitting longer in silence. The same heaviness he thought he had escaped was returning. Lydia tried everything. She prayed, she fasted, she visited hospitals. Doctors said the same thing they had said years ago to Grace. Everything looks fine. The words did not comfort her. 2 years passed. By then, Margaret had stopped pretending. "So what is the problem now?" she shouted one morning. "Did my son marry 2 barren women?" The words hit Lydia like a slap. She stood there, shaking. That night, Lydia cried the way Grace once had, quietly, into her pillow, careful not to make noise. She began to notice things. The way Daniel avoided conversations, the way he never once suggested checking himself, the way blame always seemed to land on the woman. One evening, Lydia sat alone and thought deeply. She saw her future clearly. Insults, pressure, silence, eventually, exile. She made her decision quietly. Lydia packed her bags at dawn. Daniel watched from the doorway as she tied her last bag. "I can't stay here," she said calmly. "I won't be measured by my womb." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He said nothing. Margaret arrived minutes later. "So you two," she scoffed, "are all of you pretending?" Lydia did not respond. She walked out of the house with her head high, and just like that, Daniel was alone again. While Daniel's home collapsed in confusion, Grace's life moved slowly, painfully forward. The first year back at her parents' house was the hardest. She felt like a burden, like a failure, like a woman whose life had expired. She avoided gatherings, avoided conversations, avoided mirrors. But slowly, healing began. Not dramatically, not magically, Grace started small. She took up work, she joined a women's fellowship, she learned to sit in silence without hating herself. She learned to pray differently, not begging God to prove her worth, but asking him to heal her wounds. That's when she met Michael. He didn't rush her story. He listened. When Grace finally told him everything, about Daniel, about being called barren, about being thrown out, her voice shook. Michael did not interrupt. When she finished, he said softly, "Your worth was never in your womb." Grace cried, not loudly, but deeply. Years later, Daniel sat alone in his house. 2 wives gone, no children. His mother's voice still sharp, but quieter now. Doctor's appointments followed. Tests, silence. Then the truth arrived, slow, heavy, undeniable. "The issue," the doctor said gently, "is not your wives." Daniel felt the world tilt. Memories flooded back. Grace standing silently. Grace picking up her bag. Grace walking away. Regret came late. Too late. Grace did not fall in love with Michael immediately. In fact, she resisted it. Love, to her, had become something fragile. Something that could turn sharp without warning. She had learned that promises could rot under pressure, that affection could disappear when expectations were not met. So she kept her guard up. Michael noticed, but he did not push. He showed up steadily. He spoke gently. He never asked questions that demanded answers before she was ready. They talked about life, about faith, about disappointment, about becoming someone new after loss. Grace felt herself breathing again, not because someone wanted something from her, but because someone finally saw her as enough. When Michael eventually asked to marry her, Grace cried for a long time. Not out of joy alone, out of fear. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked quietly. "What if I can't give you children?" Michael held her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Grace," he said, "I'm not marrying your womb. I'm marrying you." That was the first time she believed she might be safe. Their wedding was simple. No pressure, no whispers, no expectations hanging in the air like judgment. For the first time in years, Grace felt peace in her own home. They prayed together, not desperate prayers, but honest ones. Sometimes they prayed for children. Sometimes they prayed just for strength. Michael never counted months, never asked questions, never watched her body with suspicion. 2 years into their marriage, Grace woke up one morning feeling different. Not exactly sick, just aware. She brushed it off at first. Fear had taught her not to hope too quickly, but something in her spirit would not settle. When the test came back positive, Grace sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, staring at it. She did not scream. She did not run. She wept. Deep, quiet tears that carried 5 years of shame, rejection, and unanswered prayers. Michael found her there and knelt beside her. When she showed him the test, his hands shook. They prayed. Not loudly, not dramatically. They thanked God. Pregnancy did not erase Grace's scars. There were nights she woke up afraid it would disappear, afraid it was real, it was a cruel mistake. Michael reassured her constantly. "God didn't bring us this far to mock us," he said. When their son was born, Grace held him and cried until her body ached. Not because childbirth was painful, but because redemption had weight. This child was not just a baby. He was proof that the names they had called her were lies. 2 years later, a daughter followed. Their home filled with laughter, with mess, with ordinary joy. Grace stopped flinching at the word barren. She stopped measuring herself by her past. She became whole. Daniel, meanwhile, lived in quiet regret. The house that once echoed with his mother's voice had grown still. Margaret had aged quickly. Her insults softened into complaints. Her certainty dissolved into bitterness. She still spoke sometimes, but without conviction. Doctor visits became routine. The truth, once revealed, refused to leave. It was never Grace. It was never Lydia. It was him. Daniel carried the knowledge like a stone in his chest. At night, memories replayed relentlessly. Grace kneeling in church. Grace crying softly. Grace being thrown out before sunrise. Years passed before he gathered the courage to ask about her. When he finally heard that she was married, that she had children, that she was happy, something inside him broke completely. Not anger, not jealousy, regret. The day Daniel went to see Grace, he rehearsed his words all morning. Nothing sounded right. When he arrived at her house, children's laughter floated through the air. That was what hurt the most. Grace opened the door and froze for a moment. Then she composed herself. "Daniel," she said calmly. He barely recognized her. She looked lighter, fuller, whole. "I made a mistake," he said low. "I wronged you." Grace listened without interrupting. "I know now," he continued, swallowing hard. "It was never you. I was blind. I listened to voices instead of truth." He paused. "Please, come back." Grace exhaled slowly. She did not feel anger. She did not feel triumph. She felt clarity. "I can't," she said gently. "I already have a life. I already have peace." Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Grace looked at him one last time. "I forgive you," she said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean returning to where I was broken." Daniel left quietly, alone. Some lessons arrive late. Some realizations come only after damage is done. Grace was never barren. She was wounded. She was silenced. She was planted in soil that blamed her for everything it could not understand. And God, in his own time, uprooted her, not to punish her, but to save her.